everyone, and welcome to today's conversation with Karen Lord and Ken Liu. I am Diana Foe, a story producer here at Serial Box, and we're going to just open the conversation. I'm going to read the bios of both of our esteemed guests, and then we're going to just jump right into questions. And afterwards, we will have a little bit of time for Q&A. If you have any questions, feel free to just insert them into the chat, or you can save them until I say now we're open for Q&A, and then put them in the chat to make sure we don't lose track of them as our conversation goes on. So I will start. Karen Lord is a Barbadian author, editor, and research consultant. Her debut novel, Redemption in Indigo, won several awards and was nominated for the 2011 World Fantasy Award for Best Novel. Her other works include the science fiction novels The Best of All Possible Worlds and The Galaxy Game, and the crime fantasy novel Unraveling. She edited the anthology New Worlds, Old Ways, Speculative Tales from the Caribbean. Karen was a judge for the 2019 Commonwealth Short Story Prize and the 2018 Code Burt Award for Caribbean YA Literature. She has taught at the 2018 Clarion West Writers Workshop and the 2019 Clarion Workshop, and she co-facilitated the 2018 Commonwealth Short Story Prize Workshop in Barbados. She has been a featured author at literary festivals from Arendelle to Edinburgh to Berlin, and often appears at the Bogus Lit Fest in Trinidad and Tobago. We also have Ken Liu, an American author of speculative fiction and winner of the Nebula, Hugo, and World Fantasy Awards. He wrote the Dandelion Dynasty, a silkpunk epic fantasy series starring The Grace of Kings, as well as the collections The Paper Menagerie and Other Stories, and The Hidden Girl and Other Stories. He also authored the Star Wars novel, The Legends of Luke Skywalker. Prior to becoming a full-time writer, Ken worked as a software engineer, corporate lawyer, and litigation consultant. He's given conferences in universities on a variety of topics, including futurism, cryptocurrency, history of technology, bookmaking, the mathematics of origami, and other subjects of expertise. Thank you both again for being here tonight.
Thank you.
All right, so let us now jump into the questions here. To start, one of the topics that I think has been definitely current for several years is the idea of decolonizing science fiction and fantasy in the genre community. So to kick off this conversation, I think it's wise to ask, how do you personally define decolonizing sci-fi fantasy?
I'm going to jump in and go first. I would say for me, it's as simple as just writing from my perspective as a West Indian, as a person in the Caribbean, writing as somebody who was born after our country became independent of the UK. These are perspectives that are really just, to me, a natural consequence of the life I'm living, of the region that I see around me, and of the cultures that I'm steeped in. When people focus on it and say, this is post-colonial or this is decolonizing, I'm thrilled, but I almost feel as if I'm not making an effort to do it.
Yeah, Karen, what you said really resonates with me. I think a lot of times when I'm asked the questions of defining what it is that I'm doing, what decolonizing SFF means, I'm sort of at a loss for words, because I don't know if it's any sort of project or movement that I'm a part of. I'm just sort of doing what feels authentic and true to me. I guess I would just also say that decolonizing SFF is not just something that only writers with certain backgrounds are supposed to engage in. It's really an effort that all of us need to engage in. If anything, I would say that sometimes, for me anyway, personally, it involves just questioning a bunch of assumptions that I've been taught as the product of an education system that prioritizes a certain view of what English is and what literature is and what democracy is. I got my degree from college, and my department was called the Department of English and American Literature and Language, and that has certain assumptions behind it. English and American is very interesting that those are the two defining definitions for what it means to be part of a literature written in English. And I've struggled all my life, really, I would say, trying to question the assumptions behind those terms and trying to write stories that I think work from different levels that feel true to me and true to the human experience, independent of those set of assumptions about how people ought to be and what it means to have a good story.
Can I just add something quickly based on something Ken said? When he said, sort of questioning the usual structures that you're in and so forth, that really drove home a point for me, because growing up in a post-independence Barbados, in a post-independent region, also meant that the educational system had changed. It meant that we had more Caribbean literature on our syllabus. It meant that, when you said the thing about the English department, the university just down the road from me, University of the West Indies, Cave Hill campus, I believe the department is called Department of English Literatures and Languages. So it's more than one literature that they're looking at: linguistics, language, linguistics, languages, and literatures. So you already understanding that, especially for us as part of the Commonwealth, you're already accepting that you're not looking at one standard English, you're not looking at one English canon. You are already, it's accepted that you're looking at the whole world. It's accepted that you're looking at different ways of dealing with the language. So again, I have to say I'm fortunate of my situation. Yes, I still try to pay attention, be alert, and interrogate, but a lot of it was fortunately what I was allowed to grow up with.
Yeah, and what I find interesting about both of your responses, is bring up the idea of questioning, bring up assumptions, but also how you both said that you thought being writers in itself, like being writers of your perspective, is automatically folded into this idea of decolonizing sci-fi fantasy. And it, and Ken, you mentioned how it should be like everyone's priority to be focused on, being part of that conversation. I have seen conversations between writers of color and outside of, like, in a larger convention space, for example, where they're talking about working from a decolonizing point of view. And it has made me wonder, like, how often is it seen as an act of political choice being placed on writers, especially marginalized writers, as opposed to otherwise?
Karen?
No, I jumped in first last time.
Okay. That's a really good question. And I think everybody is going to have their own unique response to it. I can only speak, from my own perspective. I have certainly spoken with many writers who are, writers of color, or who self-identify as marginalized, and who really don't view their own work through those political lens. And I think it's a perfectly legitimate choice. I do think there are two levels to this. One is the very act of writing and trying to break into publishing as a writer from a marginalized background is just by itself a political act. Just the very fact that you're trying to get in and trying to, being a writer is a terribly egotistical thing. You're telling people that what you say matters, that your stories deserve their time, their most precious resource, and that you have to go out there and promote yourself and say, hey, look at me, listen to me. It's an incredibly egotistical thing to do. So writers from certain backgrounds, just by the nature of the fact that they're doing it, regardless of what stories they have to tell, are already engaging in political act. So I think there's that level to it. Beyond that, though, there are ways in which I think you can be political in different ways. I mean, for me, I've always as I was saying earlier, because my entire education has been centered so much on one particular view of what it means to be part of the English and American literature, that body of work, I've had to struggle very hard to not just decenter a certain kind of white supremacy in those kind of works, but also to recenter writers who are otherwise excluded from that perspective. It's both. It's not just decentering. You know, decolonizing just doesn't mean just decentering one thing. It also means actually recentering other works. And I do think that there is a conscious political choice at work there, and you have to choose to write in a certain way. And I think there's a lot of complexity to that decision, in the way that we have to try to engage in diversity as a truly collective quality. You know, diversity doesn't mean you find one person to represent. It means that actually many more voices coming in, not bothering to do representation anymore, but to just be who they are. I think that's the most important thing. And for all of us who view ourselves in a political, as participating in a political act, I think keeping that in mind and trying to work in a supportive way of other voices is very important. So, you know, that's just me personally going through this.
It's interesting when you say sometimes just existing, just trying to pursue what we're doing as a political act. You remind me of time I heard George Lamming speak, and he said reading is a political act. So I think it very much goes both ways. Sometimes I feel as if I'm just existing and trying to find joy in what I write and what I choose to write. But then I'm also reminded that, as it were, there's the reader on the other end of the telephone, and they're choosing to read me, maybe a political act of their own. And I do want there to be that kind of, shall we say, dual responsibility. I don't think that it should be seen as a burden necessarily for, well, as you said marginalized writers, but again, marginalized is a contextual thing. I'm not marginalized in my own country. I'm part of a 90% majority. And that mentality stays with me, even when I go overseas. I have to remind myself in certain spaces that I'm a minority because it's not the word that comes to my head. And it may sound trivial, but I've realized that it really does shape a lot of how I approach things. Sometimes to counter that, when I do deal with a colleague or a mentee who is questioning what they write and how they write and how it should be taken, I always say, you know, you ground yourself first. I think you called it recentering, you know, not just decentering the majority, but recentering the margins. And I say, no, ground yourself in the sense of who are you? Where do you come from? Where are your roots? Where are your influences? If you don't like what your influences have been, find other influences. If you know that there are stories that are yet to be told that you may have ignored in your childhood or were not presented to you, there's still the opportunity to go and seek them out. So you ground yourself in where you want to be and who you want to be, and your stories always emerge from that. And as I said, there's going to be some reader for enjoyment or as a political act, and then a political act can be an enjoyable act as well, who's going to find your story, who's going to connect with your story in some way. I want us to be both kind of responsible in our representation, but also radical in our enjoyment of just being ourselves, and not feeling as if everything is going to be work, responsibility, a task, an example, because that's just too burdensome. It's too burdensome, and it feels performative after a while. Okay, maybe I'm talking too much, but honestly, I feel like I want to say to people, that's all you need to be. You're enough, okay? Give us your stories. We're all around this campfire together, and I want to hear your tale.
That is a really marvelous way to put it, Karen. And you know, and I definitely think a lot of people in the chat seem to agree. That's really fantastic.
Let me have a look.
But
thank you.
Yeah. So let's actually move on, since you brought up you know, how we should be responsible, but also radical in the enjoyment of ourselves. It just, you know, let's turn to a couple of your stories actually that are on Serial Box that I think also reflect both responsibility, you know, and duty, but also a sense of optimism and purpose in how it's portrayed. So the two stories are, one is Haven and the other is Cities of the Sun. Now, Haven is a story that is about way stations in the Caribbean. It has a discussion about sovereign microstates. And in Cities of the Sun, the premise is that a historian and a reporter have a conversation, and they're discussing what kind of aspirational tale can they put together about futuristic cities and how these cities grow and change for the betterment of their citizens. And so I was, reading these stories and reflecting upon them, and I think about how they address forms of governance away from this Western neo-colonialism and really embrace the idea that the stories of a community tells is key to how they evolve. So how do these political themes that you write about relate to how you see community building, whether it's in genre or the wider world, is happening today?
Well, to answer that, I need to give you a tiny, tiny bit of historical and political context for a region. I'm going to tell you about an organization called CARICOM, which is a Caribbean community. Now, when a lot of us became independent from the UK, they did try to put together a federation in the 50s. The federation failed. I don't need to begin to explain to you how as a colony, your lines all go to the center. And being cut off from the center doesn't mean you immediately form networks within yourself. That's hard work. That's a long time work. And we are quite further apart, I think, than some people realize. I can't see, when I look out on the ocean around us, I can't see any land. The nearest land is like 100 miles away at St. Vincent. So there's a real sense of isolation. It's like 3 hours on a plane to get to Jamaica. And there's still some Caribbean islands and countries that I haven't seen yet. So the whole premise of Haven, where you have these way stations, literally kind of like floating islands that become connection points between the islands, first of the Eastern Caribbean islands, as I would say, was very much my way of concretizing CARICOM, of saying, let us actually imagine almost a physical representation of these connections where, we keep kind of complaining, oh, we don't have a proper ferry system. All of our flights are so dependent on, say, number of tourists who are flying in and out. But having these way stations, having these bridges in a way, was just this way to sort of, disconnect from the whole kind of global tourism imperative, and just look at our needs and our desire to be in touch, to be connected to each other. So yes, there's a bit of, shall we say, governance aspect in that, because it really is about, if you have all these fractured, separate bits, how do you become a region that's as strong as a country? I don't think we'll ever become like one state, but there's definitely this idea of, if we're to have, shall we say, collaborative governance, how can we make that kind of connection stronger? So the community building to me does in fact mean a physical presence. And here we are on Zoom, but hey, a physical presence. You're connecting in tangible ways. And now Cities of the Sun was a fascinating thing, because the person who asked me to do it, Margaret Busby, she's amazing. She is, her background is both Barbadian and Ghanaian. That's her roots. And I got to know her because she judged my debut novel, Redemption in Indigo, for the Bocas Prize, the second Bocas Prize, I think, which was won by Derek Walcott. So, no shame there. But one of the fascinating things for me is that when I wrote that story for her anthology, New Daughters of Africa, I was in fact thinking Afrofuturism, not in a Wakanda sense, but in a genuine sense of what would a real kind of civic sense mean on a continent. I always say to people, I don't really portray Africa because I've not been to the African continent. I portray the West Indies as if it were on a continent, and it's very Afrocentric. That's the way I do it. So the story there is very much of a reaching into the past and a projection into the future with the present as a sort of tension point. It's your point of action. It's your point of survival. It's your point of always like concentrating your power and your force to move things, to do things. And again, that's what community building means to me, that you're looking at your past, you're looking at where you want to go, and you're very much concentrated on the moment that you're in. And I know that's going to sound a little bit esoteric, but I think you have to bring a bit of myth and mystery into it, because that's the kind of creature that we are as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I like how, you fold in, like, here's a nice little genre bowl. You have to have your myth and mystery in order to make these stories, reach an access point, I think, of like, I'm just thinking like the enjoyment brain is now like absorbing the story, but now they're also learning things.
Yes.
And speaking a little bit about myth, I want to turn a question for Ken and talk about epic fantasy. We already mentioned that you are the author of the Dandelion Dynasty, and which is a dynamic, non-Western, sprawling doorstopper tale of like, so many, basically of nation building on various different levels. And epic fantasy, as a genre, has been critiqued as being an individualist, conservative type of storytelling, because it has the preoccupation with like the destined chosen one, for example, or the plot lines tend to stress the importance of reinstating monarchy. And I know in our conversation before this panel over email, you mentioned how writing the Dandelion Dynasty was your way to explore constitutionalism and processing the crisis in American democracy of the last few years. So how do you think epic fantasy can be seen as thought experiments away from conservatism?
Well, I don't think there needs to be a movement of that sort at all. I think people should do whatever they want. It's again, what stories are you drawn to? What stories are interesting to you? I do think that my experience of writing the Dandelion Dynasty and sort of seeing how it plays out to writers, to readers everywhere, is very much indicative about how dynamic that Karen was talking about how reading and writing are always sort of a activity that requires two participants, and I think that's where I find this whole action to be most interesting. So, a little brief aside. So one of my, I was trained as a lawyer, and one of my obsessions in constitutionalism has been this observation that it turns out that what allows constitutions to function is almost never the actual text itself, but rather the story surrounding the text. So you could have very beautiful constitutions that don't function. You could have many textually wonderful constitutions that don't lead to functioning democracies because the text doesn't really matter. It's the stories around it. As we've seen, a lot of times when we talk about how to use technocratic fixes to our constitution, to the US Constitution, to make American democracy function better, that's almost never the right approach. You have to fix the actual story around the Constitution. The text itself may be terrible, but if you have the right story, we can fix it, we can patch it up. So I ended up writing The Grace of Kings and the sequels really as a way to explore the idea of how does a people come to have its own mythology about who they are, how they're different from everyone else. How do they have the story that ends up, like Karen was saying, how do they have the right story to lead themselves to be a functioning, healthy community rather than one that's not functioning, that's malfunctioning, that becomes extremist and destructive. What ended up happening to me was, of course, I wrote the story, and it turns out that almost nobody read it as that. Everybody ends up being obsessed with how Chinese it is and how Asian it is, rather than how American it is. And that just got me into thinking about why that is. So you can write, so if you think about it, even the majority story of America's founding is not American at all. Our founding fathers style themselves as Roman republicans. They gave themselves names like Publius, and they constructed the capital in this style that's pseudo-classical, which is really ridiculous when you think about it. But the fact that American democracy is founded on this mythology reaching back to Rome is almost never questioned. That's somehow okay. But when I try to talk about American democracy using an East Asian mythology and a set of East Asian philosophical debates, people's immediate reaction is that has nothing to do with us. That's just exclusionary. So that to me gets into this whole idea about how there's one aspect of decolonizing SFF that's actually very difficult, which is the way we talk about diversity in America is often you stay in your own lane. So if you write about Chinese mythology, it has to be only Chinese. It has nothing to do with us. And I don't really know what the answer to that is. I feel the answer isn't to give up and just sort of, I could give up and just write my American fantasy using Roman models, but I don't want to do that. I'm not particularly interested in that model. I'm interested in, again, like I said, reconceptualizing what the American story is, in the same way that you can tell the story of Hamilton using non-white actors. That's the whole point. I'm reconceptualizing the American story using East Asian mythology, in the same way that we've always tried to tell the story of America using Roman mythology. And there's no reason to do that. Recentering and decentering and reconceptualizing is very much what I'm trying to do. And until you can really get into the heart of it and say, there is no one way to tell the story. It requires all of us to tell authentically our own stories. There can be no truly communitarian story until each of us gets to tell our own story.
I'm just taking all the notes. I really love the about how you framed it, about putting together and reconceptualizing something that feels like in other aesthetic constructs, perhaps American, but just using a different aesthetic form.
Yep.
Yeah. And I guess like to bounce this back to Karen, I'm just wondering if like the form of your story or the aesthetics of your story, do you feel like you have experimented or written about in the same way, saying like perhaps if I use a certain aesthetic and apply it to convey a certain story idea, that would make it a certain fresher spin or a different spin that the reader might not expect?
I don't think I've been that specific. But you see, part of the problem sometimes of writing things is that I write to discover. So sometimes you are writing something and it just feels cool and you're riding the wave, and it's only after you look back, you're like, oh, that's what I was trying to do. So I know that some people argue that, even if you look at something like, say, The Best of All Possible Worlds, that, almost like, well, each chapter is a different place. Each chapter is like going through different countries of the Commonwealth, actually. So, there is an aspect there where you could say that I was, trying to put my finger on just a touch of different aesthetics, not deep, because they're traveling. There's a way in which the tourist, the traveler, never gets deep into the culture. They just sort of see the surface and they move on. So in that sense, it wasn't the same. I think as well that in addition to looking at different aesthetics, I'm trying to find, I don't want to say universalities because that term gets a little abused. I'm trying to find commonalities. I'm trying to find, shall we say, story foundations that everybody can recognize. And I know it's got me into trouble a few times because sometimes people do come to a particular genre of novel expecting a certain type of structure, expecting a certain type of hero. And then they're like, oh, she's subverting this or she's doing that. And I wasn't being that intentional. I really just maybe thought it didn't make sense. That's how I get writer's block, when I'm trying to do something and then it just doesn't sit right with me and then it can't go forward, so I go somewhere else. But the intentionality of it, I'm not quite that clever.
Karen, I wanted to follow up on something you said. What you said there really about form and and discovering in the process of writing really resonates with me. And this is something that has really, I feel like I'm a much better writer now after 2 decades of doing it compared to when I started, largely as a result of having discovered things through writing. One of the things I've discovered is just this whole idea of commonality rather than universality. I think universality is often a very difficult word to use neutrally, because oftentimes when we use it, we mean entirely different things. I often get told by people like, why don't you write XYZ who writes universal stories? And what they mean is that person is also Asian, but never writes Asian characters. Right, exactly. And I'm like, okay, interesting that you view things that way. And it's frustrating when that happens. So, I don't want to use universality because it has a particular connotation. So commonality. One thing I've discovered is just how harmful a colonialist mindset really is, not just to those who are quote unquote marginalized, but also people who are actually occupying the perspective, the perspective of the colonizers. So, for example, we talk about Western narrative forms versus non-Western narrative forms, but if you dig into it, it's really kind of silly. What we mean by Western narrative form is one very, very specific tiny strain of the Western tradition, what I call toxic individualism. It's this whole idea that I really dislike the whole idea of trying to oppose Western versus non-Western in the sense of individualism versus collectivism, because it's nonsense. It's total nonsense. If you dig into some of the greatest Western, canon classics, they're not about toxic individualism at all. They're about relationship building. It's really about centering relationships and centering the idea that it takes a community to succeed. It takes a communitarian story to succeed. So, what I would rather say is the colonialist mindset has taken one string of Western culture and made it into this self-referential parody of itself. And there's no reason for us to give in to that model at all. When I try to write my own epic fantasy, I often say, my models are really the Aeneid and the Odyssey. And if you want to go the roots of Western culture, you can. These are communitarian stories. These are not stories about 3-act structure. These are not stories about the chosen one at all. They're actually very different if you dig into them. And I think it's about sort of saving the Western canon from the colonial mindset itself.
Saving it from itself.
Right. I want to rescue these works so that they don't become co-opted by toxic individualism and they can be seen properly.
Can we just take a moment to confirm that phrase, toxic individualism?
Yes.
Because I think we're going to need to use that phrase more than once. Because no, honestly, I have to say, when I was a diplomat some years ago, one of the things that we did at a workshop in the Netherlands was look at various cultural studies of how countries varied. And one of the things, of course, was the whole communality versus individualism scale. And I agree, it's a very binary way of looking at things. It's a very, we're going to put you on this thing and so forth. And there really is this habit of, what's the term I'm looking for? There's an extent to which when you codify things, when you define things, you do not free up your ability to speak about them. You instead box them up and tape up the box. And then you assume there's nothing outside of the box. And this is a problem. This is a problem. So it's not so much that you have this approach, it's that you then insist that it's the only approach or the best approach. And that kind of structural supremacy, structural whatever is what I can't take, you need to be able to say, here's one way of doing this, here's another way of doing this, these are the pros and the cons, as opposed to this is what civilization looks like, or this is what literature looks like, this is our canon. No, I fight against that too, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Are we being radical yet?
think we're just trying to be common.
Yeah.
Our communal radicalism is very evident right now, I suspect. Yeah, so I guess to speak more, and I just love, everything that like you've both said about the colonialist mindsets, the toxic individualism, and the assumption of Western canon. And this might go a bit off from like the questions we had discussed, but it just totally reminded me of something I literally read yesterday about the new craft book that came out. And it's just, and that was the premise. So the author is Matthew Sales's, and he basically like, it's called Craft in the Real World, and he basically takes down not just like the US based MFA system, but the whole idea of like how we teach fiction writing in classrooms like in the United States and Europe, because of like this, weird set of expectations that where craft is assumed to be standardized when it's not. So I don't know if like both of you want to speak to that idea about deconstructing craft.
Well, I can say one thing just to get it started. I mean, I do think there's a lot of unexamined assumptions baked into a lot of craft advice and a lot of craft teaching that we do. I mean, the example I'm about to give is old and hoary, but I think it still is relevant in some sense. I think a lot of times writers go around, and at least writers trained in the way that I was trained, which is in the workshop format, and you read craft books in the field written by important authors, and you say, this is the way to do it, so I'm going to do it this way. One bit of advice that I hear often bandied about is, show and don't tell. This is sort of like assumed to be just basically true, and it's
You're hitting all my buttons today, man.
It's just assumed to be a apolitical, neutral statement of universal fact. I mean, I often see craft books saying like, this is just it's a human universal. This is show but don't tell. In some sense, I understand the advice, and it is in fact very relevant. But in another sense, the advice is deeply colonialist and not examined. So, for example, one thing that's not often mentioned that Karen alluded earlier is reading and writing requires two people. You as the writer constructs a structure, a set of words, but you cannot put all the stories that lie behind those words into it. The way I understand the word love is informed by my own experience. The way I understand justice, liberty, all of these words is informed, it's informed by the set of stories that I went through myself. When I put them out there in a structure and the reader comes to it, the reader has to actually pack those words first with their own set of stories, their own unique personal stories, before they can extract meaning from it. So in a very literal sense, the house I built is not the house they move into. They have to decorate it before they can feel at home and extract meaning from it. So if I'm trying to show but don't tell, it only works if our set of stories are shared, that the things I assume to be universally true are in fact true. The way I understand and illustrate and show how a parent loves their child is not necessarily the same as the way you understand how a parent loves a child. The way I assume a family with 4 generations living in the same house, that's beautiful, that's lovely. But for many people raised in the toxic individualist household, that seems like a nightmare. Like, why would you have adult children living with their parents? That's a terrible thing. So if I don't tell you that this is how it works, you're not going to get it. I cannot show you if we don't share the same assumptions. So I over and over again, I have to say, the emphasis on show but don't tell deliberately silences some stories and some writers and tells them that their stories are no good, when in fact the issue is there is a time to tell and there's a time to show. Knowing when to do which is all that matters. That's the real advice.
You've just given me an idea that I have to write down. I've been doing some world building workshops recently. And, without giving you spoilers, one of the things I do is I take the first few paragraphs of 3 novels, Midnight Robber, Train Spotting, and A Clockwork Orange. And I say to people, okay, what's going on? And of course, if you're dropped into those novels, it's frightening. It's not a standard English. You're dealing with one non-standard, well, Scots is actually, you can't even call it in English. You're dealing with an invented Caribbean dialect, and you're dealing with Nadsat, which is completely invented. But what the authors do, which is absolutely fascinating, and I point out, is they show and tell. So they will show you something that may seem to have no context for you whatsoever, but then they subtly tell you in the same sentence or another sentence, just by a little repetition. So you're like, oh, now I can connect that, and you have that knowledge, you go forward with it. And then the next time they'll mention it, because they know you already have the context, they won't tell you again, they'll just show you. And I was like, when you said that, I was like, that's it. That's where the subtlety is. And that's where, for me, a lot of, sorry to say it, the Western canon does fall down, because there are too many authors who march into their novels with an assumption that readers already have a certain set of context. I mean, I'm happy when, a reader picks up, Caribbean works, and at least, puts in the effort to Google some words, to Google what a duppy is, for example, but, or Google what a midnight robber is, because that's a very specific thing. But there's so many British and American authors who do not cater to me whatsoever in their works, whatsoever, because they're the universal, they're the standard, and then as you say, that becomes the assumption into the craft, where it's like, oh, you don't have to give all this context because everybody knows X. No, I don't know how baseball works. No, I don't understand the rules of football. No, I don't quite get the high school clique thing. If you really do think that you're talking to a global audience, you are going to need to show and tell me for me to get your story. So yeah, that's actually something I'm going to try to break down into a classroom setting, and I explain that one a bit more using your phrase, and I will credit you.
And thank you. And I was going to say also, I often, talk to writers, and I say, show but don't tell makes sense, but you have to understand, the perspective from which it's offered. And at the same time, if you choose to show but don't tell and people don't get it, understand also that's not necessarily a comment on your craft. It's a comment on just different assumptions. There are, here's the other piece I often tell people, which is, I think a lot of times in workshops we tell people, again, without really much thinking about it, that the reader is always right, and that you have to respect the reader. And I say you have to respect the reader who you are trying to reach. You are not trying, in fact, to reach every reader, and it is okay to not reach all readers. That's actually okay. If you choose not to tell and to explain because you don't care that there's a set of readers who just won't get it, that's perfectly fine. Just
know your audience.
Accept that.
Yeah.
Yes, I tell people, I'm nobody, but I give you permission to not like some of your readers, to not respect some of your readers, and to say, F them, that's okay.
I want to go a little further down that road. Sometimes when I am showing and not telling, I want the reader to be uncomfortable. I want them to not know what's going on. I want them to steep in that discomfort. And one of the biggest criticisms I do tend to see on various sites that shall not be named is how confusing people find my stuff. And I'm like, I want you to feel like a fish out of water for at least 1/3 of the book. And then things are going to start to click, because that's exactly how the protagonist feels. So I realize that there are quite a lot of readers who are very unhappy with that. They want a book that's going to tell them straight away where they are, who the protagonist is, what color hair and eyes they have, who their immediate relatives are, and what their destiny is. I'm serious, and I'm kind of like, come on, we just met. Take a little time, sit down, let it unfold. But it's again a difference in approach and style. But I'm bad that way. I just don't cater.
Karen, what else is amazing though? It's sometimes the readers who complain about the fact that I put some Chinese phrase in there, they will have no problems being immersed in pages and pages of Elvish. That's totally okay. But you know,
there goes another button. Oh my gosh. Oh, it's interesting. But as you said, you know, reading is a political choice. What you choose to decide is interesting. What you choose to decide is worth research, is worth your attention. You know, all of these are choices. And that's why I put it that way, because it's like, I can give you my stories, but you got to pick them up. You got to do something with them. And I'm not going to put the burden on my shoulders that I wasn't a good representative of whatever. No,
Yep.
just no. Oh, having said that, sorry, I do want to say that I only can have that level of comfort in sort of dismissing the reader who doesn't try, because when I first started writing, it was very important to me that the critics in my own country and region saw value in my work. Even if there were reviewers overseas who were like, this is nonsense, I don't get it, I don't see what the fuss is. I needed to be able to see reviewers and academics and critics here get it. And for me, once I had that, that was my foundation. And then everything else, I could just sort of filter out the gold from the dross. But I needed to know that the people who knew the foundation that I was building on could say, yes, this has some merit, or no, she needs to go back to the drawing board.
Yeah. And
falling behind on the notes. I'm sorry if I
know, no, it's okay. Like, you know,
comments.
These are just, I mean, I'm hoping that our people watching this now are like live tweeting everything that's going on. This is definitely something that other people, you know, need to hear. All this. For our I guess I'm just gonna have like one more question, and then we can open up for Q&A, because I think the chat is just hopping with all the things, and I want to give our audience a chance to offer some questions. So yeah, so I guess I'm just gonna jump to this one about optimistic sci-fi. You know, it's something that I, as a story producer and as an editor, you know, have seen more and more often, in the last few years. One example, of course, is the renewed interest in subgenres like hope punk and solar punk. And a big theme of these types of stories, which I think we've already touched upon in this conversation, is about working toward the collective good. So do you have any thoughts about how our current fascination of optimistic sci-fi is a response to previous iterations in sci-fi, like dystopia?
Okay, should I?
Karen, go ahead.
Okay, so the way I'm hearing your question, it almost sounds as if you think these things might go in cycles. Like we sort of consume dystopia until it becomes a bit too much, and then we turn towards utopias, and until we get tired of that, and then maybe we go back to dystopia. But I just want to remind people that utopias and dystopias are unevenly distributed in the world as well. And I think I said a while back, a few years back, that grimdark is something that you understand when you appreciate when you're sitting in your comfy chair with a cup of tea and a biscuit at your elbow. Okay, mm-hmm. It's not something that you appreciate when you are, in your 10th power cut of the week after a hurricane, and the solar water heater hasn't worked. You've been having cold showers for the past 3 days. So you need to look at that kind of context. When people have scoffed at my work or some other people's work about being too hopeful, I have not really taken those criticisms on board, because I feel as if I'm in a place where I need to reach to optimism, because the place that the region is in is not all that good. We need certain aspects of global economy and global governance to work better in the favor of microstates. Mm-hmm. And we're often not in control of our own destiny. So it makes perfect sense to me that I would write something that is a little more cheerful, a little more, okay, I got a little bit of control now. Now, people turn to hope punk now. I'm sorry, it's a pandemic. You know, you guys got scared for the first time in your lives. Yay, welcome to the club. Okay, you feel out of control. You feel as if, you know, there are things that are beyond what you can manage and beyond what wealth and technology and whatever can solve. This is where we've been for decades. This is where we've been for generations. So yes, I do understand that people are turning to optimism now, but I do want it to be a constructive optimism and not an escapist optimism. If it is going to be constructive, if it is going to be about let's find solutions to these problems, I'm all for it. If it's just going to be about, you know, I'm just going to shut out the world for a bit, that too has value. Goodness knows, we got to like manage our mental health and all this. But I'm not as interested in producing that right now because I really am desperate to find solutions.
Mm-hmm. And Ken, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, Karen, thank you. You know, what you said about dystopians and utopias being unevenly distributed, that is so true. And it's in fact one of the key things that I have to deal with when I'm sort of talking to people about scenarios for the future. You know, I think of myself as deeply optimistic. I'm always telling happy stories in my view, but often readers don't react to them that way. And I've tried to identify exactly why. Because, you know, often I tell these stories in which in the future, the United States is no longer the preeminent power in the world. It's no longer the great power. Somehow that to a lot of people seems dystopian, which I find very amusing. You know, I'm opposed to all forms of centralized power. I don't really see why one country needs to be the leader of the world. I'm much happier with the world in which we live in microstates and in city states, really, where we actually have a direct sort of control over what it is, the policy's decisions over the individual, and that centralized authority, the kind of all-encompassing, all-dominating, all-pervasive centralized authority is a matter of the past. And then I do view stories in which I talk about that kind of breakdown of authority and the emergence of local communities as an optimistic, hopeful vision. The fact that not everybody sees it that way, to me, is interesting, and to think about why that is. And then I also think, like, you know, our concern about optimistic sci-fi often is related to the fact that it's very easy to point out all the ways that things can go wrong. But, you know, if you keep on telling stories about how things will go wrong, what exactly are you trying to achieve? I mean, I don't really believe sci-fi is about predicting the future. I've said many times that trying to tell stories that inspire, you know, I said good stories are more important than good institutions. So I try to tell stories of hope. I try to tell stories about how people can actually
did you
things.
note that down? Did you write that down? We need that. Good stories are very good. No, seriously.
I just fundamentally like people, you know, I'm a sucker for people. I like people, and I fundamentally want to see people succeed, not governments, not states, but I care about people.
Oh, and that is a really great point to end on, I think, before we open up to Q&A. So we have about 8 minutes or so. You know, if people in the chat have anything they want to ask our panelists, you're welcome to just type it in and I can pass it on. So.
Wow, we've got a few here.
All right. So the first question is from Laura Wells. How did you overcome gatekeeping in publishing?
Well, my answer is I didn't. But God bless small presses who are always willing to take a gamble. I think that is true both in the genre and for outside the genre, literary works. I mean, I've just been applauding a Trinidadian novel that won the Costa Book Award, which was published by People Tree Press. People Tree Press is like one of pretty much the preeminent, you know, kind of Caribbean literature publisher. And this is a mermaid story. This is The Mermaid of Black Conch. It's a mermaid story, and it is absolutely amazing. And there were plenty of people who would have passed on that. Mainstream publishers wouldn't know what to do with it. But the small publishers are our saving grace. So my answer is, if you want to push back against gatekeeping, make sure that the small presses, the independent presses, can always do what they do, because they are our way in.
Karen, I want to second that. I think I will say this. A lot of times when we complain about gatekeeping, the very act of complaining, the very act of being frustrated gives them more power. You know, if you keep on asking for approval from people who don't approve you, what are you doing other than giving them more power? You know,
Yes.
Try to look for readers and publishers and readers and folks who get you, who are interested in supporting your voice, and do that. You know, again, I mean, you know, this seems basic, but it actually took me 20 years to get to the point where I'm comfortable about it. When I started, the idea that white readers will like my work was very important to me. The idea that I would win awards that are juried by white judges was very important to me. The idea that I would win awards from Europe was very important to me, because, you know, that's prestige. Those are people with power, so you have to be approved by them. It took me many, many years to get to a point where I would view it the opposite. I would no longer be interested in that, and I would view what I used to do as giving them more power. It took that long for me to get to that point, but I wish all of you would get there faster and
Yes.
not crave approval.
Listen to the man.
I wish all of you would not seek approval from people who are never going to like you, and whose approval actually don't matter.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, goodness. Yes.
You know, and it looks like in the Q&A box there are a bunch of questions, so I'm going to try to sort through and see which are the ones that we would have time for. So let's see.
I'm going to be really bad and ask if we can at least have Zen's question, because it's a kind of a question to both of us, and she's a good friend and she's close to my heart.
All right, so Zen's question. I'm fascinated by the idea of Karen writing the West Indies as a continent, and Ken's Dandelion Dynasty, drawing on the ideas and cultures of two massive land-based empires, which is set in an archipelago. Can you both talk about the geographical and territorial choices you've made in your writing?
Ooh, see that? See that? That's a world builder question, yeah? Well,
totally.
my answer to that is, one of the things that has frustrated me in real life is our transportation difficulties, is how disconnected we are. So citing a West Indian culture on a continent is my way of saying, okay, we get rid of the ocean for a bit. We put it nicely on the coast, nice and neat. We don't get rid of it totally, but we are now connected by landmass. And now what happens to the culture? So that was my main motivation.
For me, it was for two reasons. One is it was a conscious choice to try to guide the reader into not interpreting Dara, my fantasy land, as an alternative China, because it was meant as a commentary on the idea of constitutionalism and how a people, you know, get their mythology. I wanted to get as far away from a continental Chinese interpretation as possible. But there's actually another reason which ended up being far more important, which is the islands of Dara are meant in some ways to invoke the way all large monolithic cultures are really islands of diversity within. The United States is often, you know, when you ask people from outside the US what American culture is, they bring up McDonald's, they bring up this or that. But, you know, if you're actually American, you realize just how much more interesting America really is. There are little islands and pockets of diversity. You know, we all live in little islands, really, and then we take trips to visit each other. Like Karen was saying, sometimes these trips are hard, and sometimes they are easy, and sometimes these trips can give us a lot of pain, and sometimes these trips bring us a lot of joy. I wanted people to reconceive of large, monolithically appearing countries as really islands of diversity, as microstates in collection. When you visualize America that way, instead of the Mike Pompeo vision of one America, one way, this is what it means. You reconceive America as islands of diversity. It's just so much more beautiful and lovely to me, and that's what my diary was meant to represent.
Nice, nice.
Oh, we're actually closing in on the hour, and so I guess I'm going to wrap this by thanking you both for your time today. This is galaxy brain level conversation we just had here. I am so delighted. Thank you everyone who attended.
Yes, thank you to the audience.
And also,
thank you so much.
Both of you mentioned what works you currently have in Steel Box that people can check out.
Okay, I have Unraveling, which is my 4th novel. It's actually a sequel to Redemption in Indigo, but whereas Redemption in Indigo is based on a folk tale that could be read aloud to your child, Unraveling is about a serial killer and is a little bit bloody, so you don't want to read that aloud to your child. I don't know why I do that, but and then there are the 2 short stories you mentioned, which is Haven and Cities of the Sun. I feel like I'm forgetting something. Sequel to Galaxy Game is with the editor. That's all I can say. We'll see.
Awesome.
We'll see if it makes it past the editor.
I have a whole bunch of short stories on Serial Box, and one of them, Summer Reading, is actually read by George Takei. So you can check it out. I think he did a phenomenal job. One of the stories that I think is most relevant to what we talked about today is called In the Loop, which is a story very much about reconceptualizing heroism in a Western but not toxic individualistic way. It's about a young woman who has to come to terms with her own participation in a colonialist war, and how she has to re-examine what it is she does, and then try to come to terms with all the terrible things she does, as well as all the good reasons behind it. And I think, I don't give any easy answers. And I think, to me, that's sort of the most authentic kind of story. I often tell stories in which some difficult ethical issue is presented without necessarily saying there's one right answer, because I don't believe there is.
Okay. I have a quick question, if I can, before we wrap up.
Sure.
Can somebody do a cut and paste of the Q&A?
Oh, yes.
And please send it to us by email, because there were really some excellent questions in there that I'm really sorry we didn't get to, but I'd like to have a look at them, and if possible, tweet out some answers later on.
Oh, that's a brilliant idea, actually. Yes.
That is brilliant.
That cut and paste. I am making sure we get all the questions currently updated. Yeah, and I will email them to you both. And you can
Perfect,
respond.
thanks.
Yeah, feel free to respond at your leisure, and also tag both myself, if you wish, definitely Serial Box.
Yes.
Make sure that we can tell our audience today, you're answering the questions now. Get your here. Awesome.
Of course, this is also our cunning plan to make sure that you're all following us.
Oh, yes. So for those who aren't, and we could do our final send off, if you want to talk about what your Twitter handles are so people can follow you.
I am Dr. Karen Lord. That's Lord, no E. Sorry, that's an in-joke. Most people in Barbados who are Lords are Lorde, and I always have to correct them. Dr. Karen Lord, Dr. Karen Lord.
And I'm KYLIU99 on Twitter.
Yep. And I am Writer Syndrome, one word, on Twitter. So
see, mine was so direct and simple. You guys have got these little curly cues on yours.
So thank you again to you both. Thank you, everyone who attended today, and have a good night.